Hello, and welcome to another wonderful episode of Furries in the Media, the series that reviews videos and other media based on how the furry fandom is represented. So, Abergwine, what are we covering today? Well, Sam, we're gonna hop into our time machine and set the clock for 1999, because today, we're gonna be reviewing an article published in a December issue of Metro Silicon Valley that features furries called Furries of the Valley, Wild Animals in a High-Tech Wilderness. Metro Silicon Valley, or just Metro for short, is a weekly newspaper that focuses on the culture, entertainment, and local news of Silicon Valley. In 1995, Metro launched an online version of the newspaper called Metroactive. The article we're covering was initially published in the print version of the newspaper, but it has since been archived on Metroactive. If you want to check it out for yourself, I've included links to the article and its parent issue in the video description. Let's get into the article itself. The article starts off by introducing us to Ben Cottrell, a 19-year-old working in Silicon Valley's tech industry who says he, quote, knows he is an animal. I am a wolf and that's who I am, Ben says with serene certainty. The article notes that there are a growing number of like-minded individuals who call themselves furries, and some places in the valley are known to be furry-friendly. There are a few apartments known to insiders as the Furry Arms. The article also states that network administration consultancy Taos Mountain is, quote, considered by many to be a furry-friendly company. At this point in the article, we're given a rundown of the furry community. The article states that the furry community grew out of the sci-fi fandom in the 80s and is made up of overlapping groups: anthropomorphics, fursuiters and plushies, and lifestylers. Then we're introduced to Tom Howling Geller, another Silicon Valley furry who joined the furry community at age 30 because he wanted a new way to relate to his body. He says he has heard the term misincarnated, referring to the feeling that you aren't in the right body. He also says that he had actually forgotten that he had been incarnated in the first place. Quote from Tom, I think it's a geek thing to forget about your body. The article moves on to note that while not all furries are geeks, there is a lot of overlap between the two subcultures, most notably the way furries utilize MUCKs like Furry Muck and websites like fur.com to meet and socialize with one another. The article speculates that perhaps geeks are used to relating to one another in a way that transcends the surface-level details, small talk, and outward appearances that characterize most human interactions. They get another quote from Ben. To be a furry, you have to react to the person on the inside rather than what they look like outside. The article notes that just as animals do not cast moral judgments, furries cast aside judgment to welcome anyone who wishes to join the furry community. The article then acknowledges that the furries' love of companionship, physical affection, and sexual openness has led many to mistake furry as something sexual in nature. The article is quick to point out that this is a misunderstanding, with a supporting quote from Tom, quote, I'm a furry because I want to be fearless about having feelings. I look to animals for ways of expressing myself about how I feel. The article concludes that in a place as removed from nature as Silicon Valley, it should come as no surprise that some people have gone furry. The article then leaves us with some food for thought. Quote, as scientist Donna Haraway once wrote, the future of humanity lies with beings who recognize that they are part human, part machine, and part animal. She called them cyborgs. In the valley, we call them furries. Now let's take a look at those review stats. Information accuracy is 100%, and the spirit is also 100%, giving us an average of, you guessed it, 100%. Congratulations, Metro Silicon Valley! And now time for my thoughts. This article is a fun snapshot of the furry fandom as it was back in the late 90s, and I think for the time it was written, it would have been a good introduction to the furry fandom. Let's get into the review itself. The article started off by stating that Ben Cottrell, quote, knows he is an animal. Yeah, what a great start. Yeah, normally I'd be on my guard with an article that makes a claim like that right out the gate, but I don't believe that Ben is being misrepresented here.
Are we sure that it wasn't taken out of context?
Well, here's the very next quote from Ben. There's a lot of integrity and balance that comes with living your life partially as an animal. This is not a case of misunderstanding a furry when they introduce their persona species by saying, I am this animal. If it weren't for Ben's second statement here, I'd be much more skeptical of the article's claim that he believes that he is an animal.
Did furries just not feel human back in the 90s or something?
Ah, glad you brought that up, Sam. While this article does lean into the post-human angle with its mention of cyborgs, I don't believe that this is just the author taking liberties with the direction of the article's narrative. I think back in the 90s, furries were somewhat more likely to identify as not human than they are today, and it wouldn't have been difficult for an author to weave elements of post-humanism into an article about furries. The next bit of the article mentions that there are furry-friendly places throughout the valley. A few apartments have been given the collective nickname the Furry Arms, and the article even claims that Taos Mountain, a network administration consultancy, is also considered to be furry-friendly. Now, WikiFur does have an entry on the Furry Arms along with the list of furries who lived there, so even if those apartments never had the official stance of being furry-friendly, there were a lot of furries who did live in those apartments during that time period. Taos Mountain, on the other hand, I have no way of verifying whether they had an official company-wide stance of being furry-friendly. My guess as to why the article even makes this claim would be because the author may have heard from local furries that Taos Mountain was furry-friendly.
Why would a company employ so many furries that it's considered furry-friendly?
Well, this article was written before the dot-com bubble had burst. There was a huge demand to hire people in the tech industry at that time. Regardless of whether or not Taos Mountain ever was an officially furry-friendly company, I think they were probably just hiring folks who had some basic coding skills, and they just happened to be furries. So, the next part of the article gives us a rundown of furry fandom history, which, as far as I can tell, it checks out. The furry fandom did indeed become distinct from the sci-fi fandom during the 80s. Then we're given brief descriptions of the groups that make up the furry fandom, and I'll just read directly from the article. Quote, anthropomorphics, people who enjoy comics about anthropomorphized animals, most famously Omaha the cat. Fursuiters and plushies, people who dress up in furry suits or collect stuffed animals. And lifestylers, people who feel that they are more animal than human and prefer to lead lives which allow them to express the animal within.
That's a lot of luggage.
Luggage?
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Good one, Sam. I don't believe the term anthropomorphics is used today, but as far as I know, the definition is correct. These days, it doesn't really matter how a person finds the furry fandom or what type of media they're fans of, as long as they enjoy anthropomorphic animals and want to call themselves as such, they're furries. Oh, and just a heads up, Omaha the Cat is a comic that does contain explicit adult content, so be sure to steer clear of it if you're under 18. The next part defines fursuiters and plushies, but I'm left feeling a little confused. Not about the definitions, those are correct. Fursuiters do dress in furry costumes, and as far as I know, plushies do collect stuffed animals. I'm just confused as to why the author felt the need to combine these two definitions into a single sentence. I was wondering to myself, is the author trying to say that these terms are somehow interchangeable? Because they sure as heck aren't and never have been interchangeable, no matter how much overlap there may have once been between plushies and furries. Confusing as it is, I don't think the author is trying to say that they are interchangeable, but I sure would have appreciated it if they had stuck respectively on the end of that sentence.
Didn't plushies and furries used to hang out together back then?
Well, you do have a point, Sam. I'm no furry historian, but I think they did interact on a more regular basis when this article was written. In that case, I can see why the author paired those definitions together if they both had to do with fur-covered accessories. I think if this article were written in the present day, I doubt we'd see plushies mentioned at all, since the two groups don't really associate with one another anymore. That said, there is still the potential for overlap between the two groups, as some furries collect stuffed animals, and I guess it's possible for a plushie to have a fursona. The last term defined here is lifestyler. As far as I can tell, the definition is correct for the time, but I don't think the term is used today. At least, I can't say that I've heard anyone use this term. The article then introduces Tom Howling Geller, a furry who joined the fandom because he wanted a new way to relate to his body. He had heard the term misincarnated, or feeling that you're not in the right body.
Would Tom and Ben be otherkin?
Tempting as it is to label them as such, I think it's ultimately up to the individual whether or not they identify themselves as furries or otherkin. The article then talks about how furries socialize with one another in online spaces like MUCKs.
Hey, yeah, I wanted to ask about that. What are MUCKs?
A MUCK is a variant of a MUD, or multi-user dungeon, which were text-based multi-user games where players would explore dungeons and fight monsters. MUCKs, however, had more emphasis on the multi-user aspects, such as chatting with other players. I have no experience with MUDs or MUCKs, but my understanding is that Furry MUCK was a very popular place to roleplay as your own furry character. Even though MUCKs aren't as popular today as they were when this article was written, roleplaying is still popular within the furry fandom today. The article mentions that the furry's propensity for closeness, physical affection, and sexual openness has led some to mistakenly believe that furry is something sexual in nature. The article is also quick to refute this misunderstanding with a quote from Tom about why he is a furry. I'm glad that the article does address this misconception, but I'm also glad that it doesn't dwell on it. I think the best way to disprove this misconception is by showing exactly what furry is about in the first place, and I think the majority of this article does a fantastic job of doing just that. The article finishes off with the conclusion that in a place as removed from nature as Silicon Valley, it should come as no surprise that some people have gone furry.
Is furry a back to nature movement?
No. If it were, I think most furries' personas might be based on real animals with normal patterns and colors, more of the larger conventions might be held outdoors, and furries would be more likely to be vegetarian than the rest of the population.
Wait, they're not?
Not according to a 2012 survey conducted by the International Anthropomorphic Research Project. As it is, I'd argue that furry is more of an expression of the self than it is a connection to nature, and I think this is because the source for the furry fandom is media with animal characters and not nature itself. This article has been an interesting retrospective look back at the furry fandom as it was in the 90s, and it's interesting to see what has changed and what hasn't. A lot of furries did and still do work in tech industry related jobs, even outside of Silicon Valley. While some subgroups within the furry fandom have come and gone over the years, I think it's safe to say that the furry fandom has been and always will be a decentralized fandom. What I mean is, it doesn't matter how a person found the furry fandom, what media they consume, what art they create, or what subgroups they belong to. As long as they're a fan of anthropomorphic animals, and they want to be a furry, then they're a furry. I don't believe that there is such a thing as an accidental furry. You can like Zootopia and not be a furry. It is completely your choice whether or not you are a furry. Anyone who says otherwise is probably a furry who's trying to recruit you. Well, that's it for today's episode of Furries in the Media. Have fun, stay awesome, bye-bye.